All right, so thank you, Elizabeth, for being here. We're really excited and honored to have you. I'm going to hand it over to Brian to talk about what's going on in the school this week. We'll talk about the lecture series, and then we'll hand it over.
Hi, thanks, Lindsay. If you could advance us right to the next slide. Perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Today is Giving Day at Maryland, and I just thought I would kind of fill everybody in as to what that's all about. So, as today has been going on, the schools and the various colleges on campus, various components of campus have been competing to get its alumni to reach out and give to the school. And we had set a target of something like $40,000 and 90 participants, and we have broken that target. We're at about 50,000 at the moment, actually almost 51,000, with 111 donors out there giving to us. And the reason I bring that up is that today's lecture series is in fact supported by donors. And I'll talk about that in a second. So what most students probably don't realize, you think you pay your tuition and that pays for everything, but that's not true. Public education is heavily subsidized by federal and state funding. And what's important to understand is that most of that money goes towards paying salaries. The architecture program's budget is something like $2.25 million, and about virtually everything there in that $2.25 million goes to paying salaries of TAs and GAs, of faculty members and staff. And that's important to keep in mind. We only have about a $45,000 operating budget in the school, and that means that the money has to come from someplace else to do things like what we're doing today. Lectures, scholarships, all of that comes from donations from people from outside. I'm sounding a little bit like PBS here today. So at any rate, I didn't bring the tote bag that you can give if you give it at a certain level. So I just want to make an appeal to any alumni that may be watching today, any faculty members that have not yet participated in Giving Day, please do so. Give, small amounts really matter. This is a crowdsourced giving that's going on here today. In fact, today's lecture is the result of exactly that kind of philanthropy. And if we go to the next slide, several years ago, Craig Spangler, who is a 1982 graduate of the University of Maryland and actually is with us today as he's driving back from getting a vaccination someplace remotely in Pennsylvania. Craig, be careful on the road. But this is Craig and his wife Mimi were considering ways to make a meaningful and lasting contribution to Craig's alma mater, the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Here we see Craig at his office in Philadelphia, where he's a principal in the firm of Ballinger. Next slide. You know Craig's work. There are many buildings on campus that are Craig's creation. Perhaps the most recent building that you might want to take a look at next time you're back on campus is the dynamic Clark Hall that's been recently completed. So Craig and Mimi hit upon the idea of creating an endowed lecture series that would provide a spotlight on emerging talent in architecture. And what that meant was that the individual delivering the lecture, that is the Spangler lecture, would not yet be a Zaha Hadid, a Judy Gang, or a Deborah Burke, but that person would perhaps in the future aspire to these awesome roles of leader architects. And so we're very happy to have another one of those potential leader architects of the future here with us today. Now, when we were thinking about how to implement this lecture, we thought that it would be probably best to hit upon the idea of making this a student's choice lecture. So what many of the students may not remember is you were polled earlier in the year and you got to vote on who was going to give this lecture. So Elizabeth, as you think about it, you're the choice. You were fairly elected and you were chosen by the students to be here today. So that's maybe why we have 220 people in the room at the present time. Hooray, hooray, hooray. So the initial lecturer in 2015 who was selected by the students is Hiroshi Jacobs, an emerging architect and entrepreneur in the Washington, D.C. area. And Hiroshi is now teaching our Architecture 670 Advanced Computer Applications course. So who knows, Elizabeth, down the line we may be talking some more. Ever since that first lecture, this group of young architects has challenged us to think differently about the profession, and this year's lecture will continue that tradition of challenging the norms of architecture. So before we introduce tonight's lecture, we need to recognize the Spangler family, Craig and Mimi and their family, for their generous donation that will ensure that this lecture is given well into the future. It's part of a perpetual endowment. So if you could come back to the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation in 100 years from now, there'll be somebody delivering the Spangler lecture. Thank you, Craig and Mimi, and thank you, and break a leg there, Elizabeth. Back to you, Lindsay.
With that, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the founder and co-executive director of LA Más. And Elizabeth, correct me if that's LA Más.
It's LA, but that's okay.
LA Más, my bad. A nonprofit that designs and builds initiatives that promote neighborhood resilience and elevate the agency of working class communities of color. Specifically, they focus on resident-led neighborhood-scale forms of community development with work that ranges from alternative, affordable housing, public realm projects, and storefront improvements. Elizabeth holds a master's degree in architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Southern California. So reminder, this presentation is being recorded via Zoom. So if you don't want to have your camera on, please remember to turn it off, and you can participate in the chat or with the emojis or in other ways. At Maryland's Built Environment School, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. So we're going to take a minute to read this land acknowledgement and take a moment to kind of reflect. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on
So you got muted there.
Oh, thank you. How far back did I get muted?
Just when you said just started to read it.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a minute to do this land acknowledgement and reflect on what it means. So at Maryland's Built Environment School, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands virtually of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. And if it weren't for the current conditions, we would be there, obviously in person. We are virtually on Indigenous land today, but we generally occupy that real space that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respect to the Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. All right, so I think with that, I'd just like to remind us of kind of the charge of the semester before we get going, and kind of what grounds all of our public events together this semester. The charge of this semester's lecture series is Fault, and this theme acknowledges that as architects and spatial thinkers, we are trained in the research, design, and management of assemblies, but we have been undeniably existing on a cultural, political, environmental, moral fault line. Through the public lectures and events like the one we have today, we aim to reflect on the loss, fissure, and inequities amplifying around us, and we aim to understand the constructive paths forward from fault to ownership, understanding, and change. So that's kind of the big picture context, and we're really excited and lucky to have Elizabeth with us here today, supported by the Spangler lecture. So thank you again to the Spanglers for their support of this program and the architecture program in general. And this lecture is the first of the semester, so we're kicking off a great series of events that will continue throughout the semester, all virtually, of course. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here. Normally there'd be a huge round of applause and you'd see 226 eager faces, but we're happy to have you in this venue nonetheless.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that great introduction. And let me share my screen. I'm Elizabeth Timme, founder and co-executive director of LA Más, as Lindsay mentioned. I'd also like to thank the student population for this vote. I'm very happy to be able to present to everyone today, and very happy to be presenting with in the UMD School of Architecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I also would like to acknowledge, and I really appreciate UMD's practice of acknowledging your ancestral land. And where I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Los Angeles, which is the traditional territory of the Tongva people. And so I really appreciate that practice that you all are instituting. So I'm going to be talking to you all today a little bit about betraying the confines of our professional practice and our pivot away from being a design-based organization into being a place-based organization. We are a group of majority BIPOC urban planners, designers, architects, policy wonks, and community advocates. As a group, we collaborate on programs that support residents of Northeast LA facing food and housing insecurity. And we've worked mostly over the last year virtually to develop 2 community-based programs that I will be talking about in a bit. My background is in architecture. I am a 3rd-generation architect, which is a dubious distinction. And I have spent my career committed to social justice, using design as a tool to engage and as a value that imparts identity and creates and imparts ownership. I began my architectural career unpacking the limitations of bureaucracy, specifically in healthcare and design. And I worked for nearly 2 years in the construction administration of the largest metropolitan hospital in the US. Then from there, I went to Rwanda and Liberia, where I was exploring design as a catalyst for social impact with Mass Design Group, where I was really interested in the overlap between policy and architecture. From there, I went to found LA Más because I saw the potential of design as this collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to public projects and civic planning. And I believe strongly that that could be used to support and voice the needs of the community. We began as an urban design nonprofit that used architecture and policy to help communities shape their future growth through pilot projects like alternative forms of affordable housing, public realm installations, and facade makeovers with small business support. In the last year, we made the decision, however, to pivot into being a place-based organization. And we updated our mission, which you can see here with the lovely GIFs. I hope, are the GIFs working? Because that's really essential. Okay, great. I'm being a little facetious. To reflect our commitment to centering working class communities of color in our work with a focus on Northeast LA. Today, we are partnering with NELA residents to design initiatives that elevate community agency through empowerment and ownership. Our current programs include a weekly food distribution program and our Backyard Homes program, where we work with homeowners to build affordable ADUs that increase Section 8 housing stock. We approach our work by honoring local knowledge and culture while bringing together the power of informal and formal systems. We focus on issues like food and housing insecurity because they are intrinsically connected to the systemic inequalities that face our working class communities of color. It's no secret that Los Angeles has struggled to house our residents. Our homeless count as of last year was 64,000, and many of us expect this number to drastically increase over the next year. Housing in Los Angeles is incredibly unaffordable for a number of reasons, but chiefly because we have not built enough housing for everyone. We've preserved housing stock for the few that have the privilege of owning single-family housing over the expense of many who live in housing unstable conditions. The median number of affordable housing units that the city of Los Angeles either subsidize or funds is around the 1,500 mark. With over 500,000 single-family homes, we saw the potential to move the needle on an impressively low number of affordable housing units being built yearly. Also, it's a little known fact that Los Angeles is the most densely populated city in the US. Essentially, what this means is that the majority of Angelenos are living in urban conditions under a suburban footprint. Suburban communities like Pacoima or Panorama City, which you may or may not have heard of, are very huge areas, and they were founded to meet the needs of white flight from city centers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And now they're home to thriving communities of Latinx service industry workers. Yet, the low density suburban single family home has been baked into a component of our land use for over the last 50 years. Today, over half of all of our land could be developed into multi-dwelling units. However, it's baked into a single family zoning code. This changed about 3 years ago when state policy allowed for accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, to be added as an additional unit on a single family home site. It was really in the early stages of this affordability crisis that Los Angeles was going through that we formed our 3 program areas, which were aimed at stabilizing neighborhood scale investments and lobbying for the inclusion of backyard homes, mom and pop shops, and first and last mile pedestrian routes to be considered as equal to the large scale urban development projects which were sponsored and supported by the city. Our first project over 5 years ago was working in Watts in partnership with Councilmember Joe Buscaino. And it was a comprehensive neighborhood study that had been issued, which we were brought into at the end. And the request was to install street improvements like trash cans and lighting to support these small businesses. Instead, we expanded this definition of support to include the creation of a small business corridor with new logos for each business, new signage, and an overall facade makeover. This project was the beginning of 5 years of work with over 40 business owners. We had the goals of meeting everyone in their business, meeting them where they were, offering expanded small business support coupled with facade makeovers, and doing what we called at the time Design Plus. We saw design as the entry point into a holistic conversation, digging into the deeper challenges a community member was facing and working to match them with a resource to stabilize their business and allow them to have a higher likelihood of surviving in a very competitive and unstable, under-resourced environment. However, after 5 years of doing this work, we were able to reflect recently in the midst of this pivot that of the 40 businesses plus that we supported, a substantial number we worked with did not survive. 1/3, over half a dozen of these businesses, design was not the catalytic element that could overcome the decades of inequality and disinvestment that they as business owners were fighting to overcome. Design did not fix the relationship between the business owner and their landlord. Design did not fix the owner's inability to access cash reserves to weather an economic downturn. And design did not fix or systemically support that individual when a family member became sick or there was greater life instability. However, the businesses that thrived, that benefited from our support and collaboration, those businesses had economic advantages and a network of support and resilience that made the difference. For us, it became quite clear that we needed to strategically position our ability to support future businesses in a longer term way. We needed to commit to being able to extend a network of immediate support and resources to ensure every business survived. Before we were the storefront people, or maybe after, we were also known as the bench people. And we were known as people who could take over LA sidewalks and concreted areas of public space with brightly colored urban design installation. The reason why we decided to call this, why we decided to talk about cheating on architecture, I think is because it's around this time that we started unpacking the misconceptions around urban design work and delved deeper into the implications behind public realm projects. This is a project we did as part of Exhibit Columbus along Washington Street, where we collaborated with local community members to program an area of downtown which housed primarily social serving businesses. The title of this project was called Thank You Next, based on an Ariana Grande song where she thanks her old boyfriends for all the help in investing in herself, but she's what's next. Much of the design of this project was meant to say thank you to past modernists, architects for their visions of future Columbus, while also saying it's really time to think about what's next and providing space that's flexible for community programming to unglue the urban environment from its statically stoic and overly formal design, which prevented community groups from feeling ownership over their public spaces. From furniture design to the pinup boards, the project was meant to invoke the feeling of the corporate office rooms where civic benefactors were making decisions for investments on behalf of communities they weren't in contact with. However, much like the majority of our public realm projects, this project was temporary. It took much longer to design, develop, program, install this project than the project's total lifespan. This is the permitting diagram showing the process we went through to permit one of our projects called Go Avenue 26, where you can see here all the bureaucracy, agencies, oversights, reviews, submittals that one has to go through to get a 6-month temporary project through the city of Los Angeles. And I'm sorry, I should have said trigger warning, so my apologies to many of the seasoned architects in the audience. Because this permitting process was in total 10 months long, in the end, we were issued our revocable permit after we deinstalled our temporary project. It has been said that bureaucracy is the laziest form of oppression. In LA, it's a major form of structural inequality that inhibits community ownership and identity. More than any of our areas of focus, the impact of this work has been the most ephemeral. It's required the most significant investment of our time, problem solving, resources as an office, and creativity. It's incredibly rewarding to be able to transform a section of the city that was previously so intrinsically anti-human in its design, to give it identity with scale and context. It has been powerful to make something as banal as the sprawl of Los Angeles playful and full of life, and meaningful as designers to be able to give the city a chance to reflect the diversity, glitter, and joy of its residents. These things have been the benefits of our hard work and expertise. However, yet in many cases, we did not change the structural condition of the public right-of-way as being secondary to cars and residual to the network of streets, highways, and dangerous overpasses. The rewarding nature of working on these projects is fleeting when in 1 to 2 years they're gone. We've painted and installed over 5 miles of public realm improvements, and the biggest takeaway for us was twofold. Policy, like streamlining the permitting process, is the biggest way to have an impact rather than doing the one-off projects that are highly temporary. Those policy improvements are necessary to make demonstrating these alternatives worthwhile. We currently have an adopt a lot policy to do just that, working its way through the council office, and it's been doing so for 2 years. Community members, second, must ask for these improvements. Otherwise, they won't be maintained, and most importantly and centrally, there won't be a sense of ownership over these projects, which we see as assets and community members more often than not see as transactional. And then to talk about the last area of work, we were offered to partner with the mayor's office to build an ADU under new progressive state law in 2017. Our pilot project sought to demonstrate that ADUs can be affordably built, contextually designed, and creatively financed. We partnered with the Bloomberg I team, which was installed in a few different cities across Los Angeles, and Los Angeles was one of them, or across the US, and LA was one of them. We partnered with Habitat for Humanity and a local CDFI, which is a community development financial institution, to develop a mortgage path for financing and building something which at the time was an emerging housing typology, the ADU. Our takeaway was, although we did a super great job building the city's capacity and learning what to require when permitting an ADU, the house was still not built affordably and could not be rented to a local community member in a section of the city facing extreme gentrification pressure and displacement. Out of the learning lessons, we created this thing we've been calling the Backyard Homes program. Our goal was to explore how average homeowners could become providers of an affordable housing model and make sure 500,000 single-family lots in LA were part of this solution. With an abundance of single-family lots in LA, we saw that there was a possibility for backyard homes or ADUs to be an alternative to traditional affordable housing methods. We saw the potential of the Section 8 program to do more than it was currently doing. We, in the end, assembled a diverse group of partnerships, and that's the only reason why this program was possible. 6 nonprofits and our housing authority came together to be able to create this program. To ensure the ADUs were affordably built, we had a relationship with Restore Neighborhoods LA, which was the general contractor, to support homeowners who didn't have financing options, and there were many. We partnered with 2 community development financial institutions to create a mortgage product, because at the time, there was no way for homeowners to actually afford to build an ADU on the market without pulling it out a second. The Housing Authority of LA, we also structured a deal with them to create a scattered sites approach so that they could monitor the 5-year commitment and help us in streamlining the Section 8 process. So that's the policy change that we created. Because of our partnership with a nonprofit contractor, we have been able to be design builders and work together in these 7 ADU prototypes, which you see here. Each homeowner has a choice of their architectural style that can either reflect the context of their community or their personal context as a homeowner, choosing to share their backyard with a housing unstable resident. Some of these that you can see here are Craftsman, Modern, and Spanish. Inspired by Sears catalogs and other prefab flat-packed home deliveries at the turn of the century, we gave homeowners a variety of flavors in their interior and exterior style options, regardless of the unit type. After the homeowner selects a unit type, we pick a style, they pick a style, and in some cases, that style is radically different in the interior and exterior. And these include colors, finishes, features, hardware specifications, and all of that is unique to each kit. Note that this plan was designed for a Section 8 tenant, and it was meant to maximize the rental income while minimizing the construction budget so that more low to moderate income homeowners could participate in the program. Overall, we set out to change the nature of how affordable housing was represented and depicted, that ADUs could be a part of an important menu of options in affordable housing, and that affordable housing didn't have to look affordable. It could represent the diversity and the spirit of inclusion that is needed for us all to pitch in and respond to the housing crisis. Overall, our impact was that we built the capacity of over a dozen organizations to build affordable ADUs through direct and indirect participation in this program. We're currently advising other agencies across the US on how to take a program like this one that we have created to scale and make it work as an initiative in their city as part of a broader affordable housing program. To shape that project, we conducted over a year of research, talking to housing experts. We interviewed over 100+ homeowners in the 15 different council districts of LA to understand what it would take for ADUs to be a form of affordable housing. We didn't just get into the business of designing and building these projects. We worked with the county and the city, and we explored how forgivable loans could be used in ADUs to house the formerly homeless. Currently, we're partnering with the City of Los Angeles again to develop prototype plans that are pre-approved through the city's time-consuming and sometimes insane permitting process. Even still, over half of the programs and initiatives we were involved in regards to housing did not result in built projects. Although we are building 5 backyard homes that will be Section 8 rental properties, transparently, when we launched this pilot, we received over 200 applications. This 5 represents the golden opportunity of someone's finances, their site, their comfort in taking on this construction risk, their commitment to being a Section 8 landlord, all overlapping and allowing for this 2.5% build rate to the number of homeowners that apply. Also, we realized that ultimately we weren't building the capacity, that we were building the capacity of homeowners in an individual one-off way, rather than a collective neighborhood-led initiative for resident-led housing, affordable housing. The amount of work that it took to develop this program design an affordable housing model that was a new typology of housing, and reach out to and work with homeowners has been immense. Moving forward, we are excited to look at more models of affordable housing that center collectivity in the form of community land trusts, intergenerational living, and housing cooperatives, to start thinking about all of the options in which we are going to make housing accessible and available to working class communities of color. Returning to these projects and being quite circumspect about their impact, we realized that we had organized our approach around our skills, our abilities, and for lack of a better word, our talents. The pitfall and the problem, and why this is incredibly problematic, is that we focused on those talents and thought that the act of using our professional abilities in concert and collaboration, that this approach was capable of addressing systemic issues and driving impact. We knew that together as a team, LA Más has been quite strong in our collaborations on behalf of communities of color. We saw evidence that I've just outlined to everyone of our ability to do things that had been thought of as impossible, insolvent, or untenable, and we were able to do those things successfully. However, we assumed that because we were creative and productive in our collaborative efforts, that we were embedding impact into our work, when in fact we were not. We were not intentional about what the impact was. And over the last 6 months, we've been looking back at our conversations with community members, residents, and stakeholders. Although there were some projects that didn't result in a long-term investment, where we had engaged and co-created with the community, in large measure, these projects were the ones we returned to, with core methodologies, deep lines of thought, and ideas that demonstrated the resilience and power inherent in communities of color. Although our intention as an organization was to be an organization that supported communities through design, in our efforts, unfortunately, we centered design as the primary thing of value, because we were not explicit or intentional about our real impact. In our pivot towards being a place-based organization, we are centering the community and the place as central to our work. This transition from being a design-based to a place-based is an intentional commitment towards having measurable and meaningful outcomes for residents, business owners, and community members that are the true center and core of our work. The groundwork and the backstory, very briefly, for our organizational transition began last fall, where we did some early discovery work with our team and our community on this place-based shift. In mid last year, a community development expert, Maria Cabildo, led us in a team retreat where our collective values and our new vision started to take shape. We had conversations with neighbors who expressed interest in creating a community resource exchange and shared their concerns about housing and food insecurity in the neighborhood. And this is really at the beginning of the pandemic, before we knew what we were entering. We reflected on our commitment to working class communities of color and examined where our impact was either meeting or missing the mark. This is a fun little GIF narrative of one of the ways we've been reflecting on community engagement impact on past projects, is using the spectrum of engagement. I don't know if you all have seen this before. I certainly didn't see this in architecture school. This is the kind of framework for community ownership, and it was developed by Rosa Gonzalez of Facilitating Power, in part from drawing on content from a number of public partnership participation tools, including Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, which is another thing everyone can look up. And this was created by the International Association for Public Participation. So if you all bear with me, I'm going to run through each of these just to kind of give distinctions and clarity about where our work was, where our work is, and where we're trying to push it to go forward. This first bucket is the bucket that is kind of the most worn in the field of architecture, and that is ignore. If you have no community engagement on a project, you are denying access to the decision-making process. The impact is marginalization explicitly, and you are treating the community as insignificant. Your message is that the community does not matter. Marginalized is the status quo. Given current systems that have been historically designed to exclude certain populations. This second criteria is inform. Inform is where you are providing the community with relevant information like an open house. This is something that is kind of the normal check off the box for many engagement projects. This is described as information is the foundation for taking action towards real solutions to the threats we face. As the saying goes, knowledge is power. If, however, community engagement efforts remain at the level of one-way information, this is kind of placation, to be clear. So the role of the community is reduced to absorbing information from those in positional power. Meanwhile, the notion that everyday people can actually shape solutions is quite stifled. The third, eating popcorn, is consult. Here you gather input from the community, and this is the most common form of kind of community design work that tends to become like a kind of mix between nonprofit and capitalist check off the box for large master planning projects. The biggest critique of this form of engagement is that decisions are already completely made when engaging the community. Community input, just period, serves to check off that box. The next, involve, which is really to ensure community needs and assets are integrated into the process of planning and informing. The impact is that the voice and the power shift away from the architect, away from the development team, into that of the community organizers. Collaborate is, it says that we ensure community capacity exists and we ensure that there's a place in this project for the community to play a leadership role in implementation and decisions from the outset, from the beginning. The impact is that power is delegated to community leaders and experts. To achieve collaboration through community engagement, really what cultural shift and system changes are needed for authentic collaboration between institutions and impacted communities? That's kind of a central core question. And the very last and the hardest and the most worthwhile and sustainable project is to defer. This is to foster democratic participation and equity by bridging the divide between community and governance through community-driven decision-making. The impact is community ownership. So these are some notable projects that we have worked on over the last 5 years. And as a team, we mapped our past projects along the spectrum of engagement, evaluating the actions and impact of our projects in the lens of community engagement. The majority of our pre-COVID projects fell into consult and involve, although I'm sure that many of the students and myself were thinking otherwise when we really started to look at the impact of our work. I would say in the case of public realm projects, we did work to ensure that community needs were integrated into the process and that community organizers had the power and voice to shape the project. That being said, how do we begin to delegate power and how do we move into collaboration? In order to move beyond involve, community organizing and power building is needed to bring community engagement out of tokenization and into a true involvement of impacted residents and the decisions that impact them. We're working through right now at this very moment how to thoughtfully build community ownership as an organization. Where a project falls in the spectrum in part depends on how and when the community is involved in the process. And so this is kind of a little peek into how we're starting to kind of organize internally our systems. And this is a work in process where we're adapting the spectrum and overlaying our own project process to address potential strategies for ownership structures. Our mission is to build community agency and resilience through our current approach is to do that through building community empowerment and ownership, if that gives you any clarity. So those are our mission and our core goals. Empowerment is a very fraught word. However, we landed on this word understanding that it has a lot of tension points because we define it as the community having power in the decision-making process. It means that resources and knowledge are accessible and that facilitates empowerment. On the spectrum, the actions and impact that define empowerment are informed to involve or people to power. And ownership speaks to owning place and program, like land, program, these really physical, tangible things. And we acknowledge the sense of ownership happens through empowerment. So this is kind of, I'm trying to tease out a lot of murky things because it's been, I think there's a lot of ways you can talk about empowerment, or you can talk about ownership without actually owning something. And that's, there's also the really important next step for there to be tangible ownership, things to have ownership over. So we had been having these conversations at the beginning of the pandemic, before we knew we were really in the pandemic. And our original plan was to transition into a more robust engagement process and a pilot program that could be co-designed with our neighbors. That was the plan. At the moment, we began to wrap our heads around what it meant to be place-based. COVID hit. And it took Los Angeles over 6 months to reach the same levels of spread as a city like New York City. However, we knew our community was already in an economically vulnerable position from the outset of the crisis. As we reconciled our lack of clear impact for working class communities of color, we were also becoming more involved in conversations in our home community of NELA, which had already been struggling to pay for the exorbitant rise in the cost of living in Los Angeles. Immediately, we began hearing from neighbors and residents of entire families affected by COVID and incapable of shopping and paying for basic amenities. Critical issues that were pointed out by neighbors during these conversations were housing insecurity and food access. These were only made incredibly worse by the global pandemic. And so when the coronavirus outbreak began locally in 2020 of March, so we had something called Safer at Home, which went into effect. And we had to pivot our operational model to provide immediate assistance to neighbors directly impacted by the crisis, all virtually and over telephone. We started by reaching out to neighbors, which you can see here, and developed this program in partnership with the neighbors that were already doing something called like an informal phone tree. And they were learning that many of their family and friends and neighbors were being laid off, or they were having their hours reduced, or they were struggling to take care of aging parents or getting groceries. And so thanks to the everyday advocacy and partnership of these two neighbors here, Ceci and David, we were able to create a more robust system to capture and track the needs and provide supportive services, which we called the NELA, or Northeast LA Community Response. Many mutual aid programs focus on one area of impact. However, early on in our response, we decided that we would equally prioritize goods and services, material assistance, and sharing information on rights and policies, because to community members, all those things were intertwined and they were a changing landscape. So most of our collateral and graphic language was inspired by this IKEA FICA cookbook, or something called the Point It Guide, which is a 1970s, 80s illustrated travel guide. And that was because we wanted to reach the widest audience, and Northeast LA has a wide number of languages. And so we knew we couldn't often translate our collateral in enough languages in enough time as we were being able to get that information. So we used this languageless guide to communicate information without words. This is a graphic outline that also explains our community response and how we were making touch points with community members during the pandemic. Here you see a group of 150 plus dedicated volunteers, which we called neighbors. And they were identifying needs, connecting those residents to resources, and we were able to help people with rent and mortgage information, unemployment, filing, etc. And here you see kind of some of the mutual aid that we were distributing. And this was all, to be explicit, something that the Frogtown and Northeast LA community was already participating in through babysitting or exchanging food. And we were kind of really just formalizing some form of resilience that was already there. We were giving craft kits to seniors and kids. In a relatively short time, we were connected to and developed relationships with multi-generational immigrant families who experienced all of this instability. And we were really able to relieve this kind of issue of debating paying for food or rent. And so we were offering cash assistance in addition to these kind of grocery drops. However, although we were doing things to pay for car payments and phone bills, which enabled community members to apply for assistance and other programs, long term, we understood we had to close the program because it wasn't able to kind of get at the systemic issues we wanted to address. So a great deal of, upon reflection, a great deal of the work we were doing was using the same skills we developed working to build the capacity of local government. We were organizing resources, explaining policy, navigating bureaucratic systems, creating an actionable, implementable program that was of tangible community benefit. So to compare this flow chart of navigating the hurdles put in place by local and state government to inhibit unlawful use of public space right away against the system that we created here in our community response, I think you can see something strikingly similar and profoundly different. One system is predicated on control and oversight, and the other is supportive and interested in translating needs into action. In the context of the spectrum of engagement, we were moving out of the confines of empowerment and into ownership. However, we didn't structure the program where we could develop the ownership category because our intent at the formation of the program was to provide assistance. We knew we needed to develop a long-term program that would assist long-term, but also could be owned by the community. We had to reconcile that we couldn't move fast enough to deal with the pressures facing Northeast LA. If LA was the most unaffordable city in the nation, NELA is the area with the greatest increase in rents due to these larger market forces and inadequate local community plan updates. Displacement of working class community members is rapidly escalating as vacancy rates increase due to market speculation that doesn't match the speed of development. Creating, running, and fine-tuning these mutual aid projects where our impact was clear, it made it really hard to return to this previous design-based model where our impact was inferred and an outcome product of our super duper awesome, impressive skills. And so our previous model no longer fit our organization. If we were going to return to this model, it seemed to be a guaranteed reality. We would repeat our past missteps rather in centering the how of our work rather than centering the who. In hindsight, what we were working towards unconsciously or consciously was community ownership and empowerment. We had talked a great deal about the working being a neighborhood scale work. And in large part, this was because we were talking about just an alternate form of community development. Once we uncoupled and removed the professional seat as central to our approach, it freed us up to begin to discuss the activities and programs that fit inside the middle, the what of what we were going to be doing. And we got incredibly excited about LA Más 2.0 and the idea of a collective organization. We partnered with Maria again to develop this mission and just wanted to explicitly, I think I also might need to wrap this up for Q&A. I just want to check in.
No, we have until 6, so we have plenty of time.
Oh, great. Okay, I was gonna breeze through. Okay. So thank you so much, Lindsay. So really central to this was shifting power dynamics. There's a lot of really invisible but concrete commitments and work that go into becoming a place-based organization and making that commitment. And one of those things was shifting power dynamics, and we believe that centering the most marginalized voices is absolutely necessary to achieve a more equitable world. And because of this, we needed to double down on our commitment to working class communities of color who had been historically left out of the decision-making process, specifically around neighborhood planning and investment. And this gets back to this, the name of this lecture, which is Cheating on Your Profession and really betraying something that you love, which is a profession that's kind of built to enforce inequity. Second is celebrating the community. And we were really explicit about people shaping the neighborhood and not the kind of buildings or the features being the defining characteristics. We couldn't engage in our place-based work without highlighting the community's strengths, rather than coming from a deficit place to kind of talk about it, inequality or lack, but to really talk about resilience and center that. We needed to commit to addressing tough issues, but also make room for joy and play and fun. And bridging our past and our future, shifting away from a skills-based urban design nonprofit architecture firm is no small maneuver. And so we wanted to be thoughtful about how we did this and how that would be kind of led by community, our community values, while recognizing the ways in which design remains integral to our work. I also have to note transparently that during this process of rewriting our mission, we had a really hard time defining our values because we had not done the work to be an anti-racist organization and be anti-racist leaders. And we struggled articulating why we were committed to this new mission because we hadn't done the anti-racist work. So we worked with the great Castillo partners to help facilitate anti-racism and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment and report as the first step in our commitment towards being an anti-racist organization. And you see here, what's really incredible is that this quote here is a roadmap for community engagement and community ownership, which was given to us by people who are not urban planners. Centering the community members, advancing their concerns and goals, and giving them the space to lead were all key takeaways of the Castillos from the anti-racism report, and all key core tenets of how we were going to, and how we have gone to build ownership into, community ownership into our organization. These recommendations in the report help plant the seeds for our next step in building programs which had explicit goals to address food insecurity while building that ownership. So in September of last year, we returned to our efforts in providing relief to community members experiencing food insecurity. We launched a weekly distribution, food distribution program, mutual aid program called Northeast LA Mercadito at the Elysian Valley Community Garden with the support of other partner organizations like Food Forward and LA Compost, which you may or may not have heard of. Since then, every Friday, we have provided fruits and vegetables to all residents, no matter their housing or immigration status at the Mercadito, free of cost. The produce varies every week. We have started a cell phone outreach list and other kind of organizing methods to notify families and seniors participating in the program. The program has run over the last 7 months and has reached over 600 plus families through word of mouth only. We have translation and interpretation available in Spanish every week, and we're working on Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Khmer. And all of our day-to-day programs and logistics and distributions are 100% volunteer-led and resident-supported. We developed a decentralized food distribution system, which is supported by local food hub leaders as well. And the majority of our food is now, recently, over the last 3 months, distributed through the food hub leaders. So just to be clear, we took something that was kind of a centralized model, and we've been working with food hub leaders to be able to take that model over and then to kind of distribute that throughout the community. Because we intentionally built out an area for our program to be led and owned by the community, the program is thriving and we cannot keep up with the scale that it's growing. And specifically, community members are growing the program. For example, our food hub leaders pick up food to distribute each of them to 10 or more families. And so they are starting to double the number of families that we're serving. So in conclusion, through a combination of unpacking the limitations of our existing programs, defining the impact we would like to have in the future of our work, and testing our emerging model through this community response and the Mercadito, we were able to begin to fill out this missing middle to our approach, which we had previously kind of centered design in. We've gotten much more intimacy with the programs we can lead to address these root causes we have always been fighting against since we began. And we have much more clarity in terms of who and how and why we are helping. Before our shift to being place-based, when we were a design-based organization, more often than not, we were bound by the limitations of opportunities to do projects, which were set up by politicians, officials, that could have impact if we squeezed it into the scope of work. In many ways, we were still reinforcing the systems of inequality and injustice that architecture and planning were organized to uphold and reinforce. Today, we are focused on building out a range of scale programs which we have the capacity to lead in partnership with the community, develop, design, and build with a deeper level of intentionality and understanding of who we are and why we are doing what we are doing. Although we had to betray the profession we love by taking design out of the center of our work, this future seems a great deal larger and more inclusive than before, and we're really excited to share with you where we are going and where we have been. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think, I mean, I'm sure people have lots of, video round of applause, of course. I'm really so impressed and struck with the confidence and clarity and humility that, you know, leaving sort of your comfort zone and the practice zone, which you obviously identified were sort of failing you in a lot of ways, or in maybe every way that you were evaluating yourself by. But it's just a really impressive story, and I'm so glad that our school got to hear that. So I think we should do some questions. If anyone has questions you want to write in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the Zoom room. Juanita, I see you raised your hand. Go for it.
For the really awesome lecture. It's really gave us a lot of food for thought. As students, we don't often get to engage with community like you have. So how can we develop kind of a framework for thinking about how we might think about policy, just learn the process of knowing where, we're learning to be designers. We're learning all the skills that you all had to kind of step back from. So how should we be thinking about this as students as we start to prepare to go out and work?
I think that often if you can take what's holding you back from really participating in your community, or have greater ownership in terms of your ability to speak to your values in your projects in school, or any of these other things that I think are kind of the stepping stones towards being able to integrate your values, but also be of service. And I think many of us get into architecture, all of us get into architecture because we really care about other people, and we really want to be able to collaborate with others. And I think if you take design out of the sentence of whatever's holding you back, it's really kind of like a helpful tool to start thinking about the spaces that you can step into, and some of which are not yours to step into, but some of which you can kind of collaborate or be an ally in. It's explicitly, the kind of conundrum myself as being a white founder with a BIPOC kind of co-leader and staff, being really sensitive to the spaces that are not disrupting anyone else's safety. But I think that all of us have kind of networks and culture and the ability to really share and collaborate with others, from like renter rights, housing workshops, homeless housing workshops, or getting into kind of different policy and advocacy seats locally, or being able to start reading about or getting into different social justice practices. All of those things are available if you're interested. And I think you don't have to necessarily be at the table. I think just being in the room is more important. And hopefully in a few years, the table won't exist because it's a kind of binary or a kind of oppositional thing that holds us back from working with a larger group collaboratively. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there are so many different ways to get involved that don't have to center design or yourself as a designer. And I think it's really hard sometimes when you're trying to think, oh, well, I need to bring a value. I need to know, I need to bring this education. I haven't finished the education. So when do I contribute and how do I get involved? And there's so much value to every student that doesn't have anything to do with their skills in design. It doesn't have anything to do with their training. It's the kind of holistic sensibility and the thing that the design profession does a great job in teaching, which is the kind of critical thinking process and the ability to kind of prioritize a lot of disparate information and criteria. And so just being able to kind of get involved in different conversations outside of the field of architecture and design is really helpful.
Thanks.
Thanks, Juanita.
Thank you. That was an awesome first comment.
So we have a bunch of questions in the chat too that I'll read out for everyone. And I think maybe the last one is where I'll start because maybe it builds on some of the stuff, Elizabeth, that you were just sort of alluding to from Hannah Gross in Architecture 402 Junior Studio. What sorts of language phrases do you use in engaging with the community to make sure you're keeping the power in the hands of the people you're working with? How do you navigate having technical knowledge of being able to do a project, but not being the leaders of a project?
Let's see, I can actually answer that. Let me go back because there's a slide that addresses this a little bit. So I would say that I think we have had really intense and long conversations about language, especially since we're all from different disciplines. And so on one side, we're all very, very cognizant about the power that language has and the way it can be inferred that we're talking for someone or we're kind of imparting something or we're kind of positioning ourselves in a place of power. And so we're all very, very clear about that not being something that we want to do. We instead want to speak from a place of resilience. I'll look it up in a second, but there's a kind of community building, a number of different community building books, and I would say current conversations on community development, really helpful for an architect to start engaging in what inclusive practices look like when you're coming from the perspective that the community already has the answers, the community is already an expert, the community already has a great deal of power and strength. The communities of color are under-resourced. They're undermined and underfunded, they're policed, they're hurt, and they're harmed. But there's immense resilience, and the ways in which communities of color survive are far more sustainable and far more powerful than kind of normative middle-class communities that, as we've seen in the pandemic, suffer and are quite tenuous in like the kind of pre-capitalism pretext. So that's first and foremost around language, is that kind of centering it in a way where we're not talking about deficit, but we're talking about power. And then secondarily, this diagram, this chart, talks about the co-creation process and being really specific about that, and then being specific about where the community leads and where LA Más leads. And so you can see here that LA Más is kind of leading in parts of implementation and co-creating with the community around that. And so that would get into construction or other development projects. But when it comes to developing and gathering and kind of having a voice, that's where the community is leading, and that there's a kind of overlap between those two things that results in that co-creation. So I think that there are real technical skills that architects have, which are phenomenal and really deep. And it's challenging that we have to study so much in only 5 years or 4 years, depending upon your college. But that work, there's a place for that work, and there's a place for you to do that and exercise that technical skill. But I think if you're ambiguous about where you're exercising technical skill and where instead you should be in the seat of deferment or collaboration, I think that's really important to be able to be from the outset of a program or a project to be distinguishing that.
Thank you.
Mide, I think your question building on community development would be a great next question. I don't know if I totally understand the emphasis or the intonation. So if you don't mind, if you could unmute, if that's all right, and maybe share your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Elizabeth, for gracing us with your presence and presentation. It's profoundly amazing and invigorating as well as inspiring. And I hope our students are taking away from it. Just in terms of how architecture can leave the capital A behind and have such an impact on the community that we're supposed to serve. So thank you so much. I guess the question I was asking, because you sort of set up the construct of development, empowerment, and ownership, that diagram that sort of permeated your presentation. And as you're engaging these communities, are they, like, in terms of how, because with these underserved communities, there's always an inherent issue of trust. Somebody coming from the outside that's supposed to do good for us and do good by us. But I noticed in your diagram with LA Más, and I think it's a great thing, where you sort of engage with the community, develop these ideas, and you sort of hand off to them, and hopefully they're self-sustaining into the future. But do you encounter a level of discourse with these communities where they see your construct not on the ownership end, where you sort of come in, you do what you need to do, and you hand it off to them? Do they question or maybe even encourage you to be a part of the investment in these communities, just, in a sense, creating skin in the game, to just ensure that sort of continuity in terms of your engagement, even after you hand it off, that you're still involved? Do you encounter that in any way? Oh, I apologize if my question wasn't clear. What I
No, it's so, thank you. It's so helpful. And it's a really good question. We've been talking about our theory of change and talking about empowerment and ownership overlapping, and how there's kind of that engagement is the air that we're breathing. And to talk about it in kind of a popping in and popping out is not reflective of the way in which we need to integrate it into every single day. So when we talk about the overlap between engagement and empowerment, I think there's going to be a lot of different programs and projects that have different ways in which we talk about ownership and empowerment. And that building trust, it's really great that you talk about it, because on one end, it's so central and it's so important to take the time to do that, to build trust, because there's been so much harm that's been built or that's been done. And there's so much disinvestment that building trust is the first thing that has to happen. But it also sounds disingenuous if it's not within the framework of a really intentional series of investments that we are making as an organization. And so I want to acknowledge, I hear you and how thoughtful that is, and that you bring that up. And also, I think we are thinking about and circumspect about housing and how much investment it will take on our part to be able to really execute housing, because we're in a situation where land is so expensive. And so there may be a situation where we're doing housing and we will never be able to not remove ourselves from the picture. However, that being said, I think the hope is that a lot of the things we're doing, we will be able to have the community own them outright, and they won't be resilient contingent on our subsidy. And so there's a lot of people talking about community development in Los Angeles, and they're really questioning affordable housing and tax credits affordable housing and a lot of the ways that we get public projects done and the way that they're supported, and really trying to ask more from capitalism in the market. And I don't have an answer for you as to how it's going to shake out, but I know that there's going to be a spectrum of different ways in which we advocate for and support ownership, and to what level we continue to be partners in that process will change. And I think when we can, we will make sure that the community outright owns it. And when we have to, we will be in a seat of being able to subsidize and support.
Thanks, Mide, for that great question.
That was a very cool question. Thank you.
Great. It was well written. I just didn't want to like kind of categorize it the wrong way. And I think I have a kind of different line. I think we've been talking about your collaboration and the production and output of you and your team. But a team takes a lot of fuel. And I think, I think about fueling a team in two ways. One is kind of energy and optimism, and, looking at a process that is nonlinear and uncertain and long, takes, I think, a lot of emotional fuel. So I would love to hear about that. And then financial fuel. How do you kind of, sustain and maintain fueling the team from both those sides? A little bit more, infrastructural questions, I guess.
Sure. So to be really blunt and talk about our finances, we had 80, maybe almost 90% of all of our funding for the first 4 to 5 years was what you would call fee for service. So it would be not multi-year, but singular one-off contracts with city partners and the city family. And that could be a council office in a council district, or that could be the mayor's office under initiative, or it could be us applying for a grant to do something physical. And those were usually, we would sign into an agreement and then we would build something and we would be done. There was no programming on our part that was multi-year. There was no kind of phased work. And that was how the majority of our work was done. Then in 2020, we applied for, in the midst of this pivot, we applied for a lot of place-based funding, which was looking at how we could address the needs of the community, looking at how we could offer cash assistance. We were demonstrating that we were connecting residents to resources that were incredibly insane and hard to apply for. And we were demonstrating that there was all this need in Northeast LA, which has a huge essential worker population. And it's also really, really close to downtown Los Angeles in the artists district. And so there's a lot of gentrification pressure. So we were really we were able to show that it was the perfect hotbed, the kind of perfect situation for a lot of pressure in this community of color of Northeast LA. And so within the last year, our funding has gone from being 80 to 90% fee for service to 60 to 70% place-based mutual aid support. So the majority of our funding is really focused on doing the kind of Mercadito, the Northeast LA community response, building out and like engaging and discussing with the community housing. We have a series of plan updates that are happening in housing elements. How does it look for communities of color to really inform that? So there's a lot to being place-based where we can get deeper, and there's a lot of foundations and organizations that really at the statewide level, at the citywide level, at the national level, really want to have groups like us that have our expertise, but also have our commitment to being place-based. They are interested in funding those conversations. And then we've had the backyard homes work, which we've been doing for 3 years, and that has at times supported around 40% of our operations, but it eats up as much as it can. So we're never in the black on any of our kind of backyard homes work, because it's so exhaustive to kind of vet and talk to every single homeowner that's an applicant. In addition to every single one of those sites that's an ADU is its own development project. So we have to go through that almost that entitlement process, so to speak, but it's not, it's just permitting process every single time. And we've been able to streamline some things, but with the design process, but many we can't. So that's the money stuff. I can get into more specifics, but is that clear enough? I don't know. We're a nonprofit, so everyone can also look on our website and see how much money everybody gets paid, which is also really cool. We're going to be readdressing as an organization our payment or our salaries and start having those be in line with an anti-racist organization. We want to get to the place where we're paying for healthcare for everyone. So we want to start looking at like how do all of our operational systems reflect our commitment to being anti-racist. So I guess that kind of starts to bridge into how we fuel ourselves or how we kind of deal with the fact that the work is really hard, which it is really hard. And I would say we have always been really explicit that we put people's families first. I have 3 children. I founded LA Más when I was 4 months pregnant. And we've had colleagues and teammates whose parents have gotten really sick, and we've had a lot of stuff happen as a team, and we offer as much support to everyone as they need. And we're really flexible with work and when people work and how. We have received funding and grants for people to be able to take time off to do retreats or to build their own capacity or to attend meditation workshops or to do leadership training. And we also do check-ins with the team on their own personal development goals. And we talk to the team about where they are in that process and how we can support them. So we try to have those meetings at least twice a year. They were supposed to be every other month, but it's been hard to do that. And we also took 2 weeks off when COVID started because we had to mourn the fact that the office that we knew was never going to exist again. So going in and having lunches, hanging out with each other, being able to do projects that were cute and shiny and pretty, a lot of those things really went out the window. And so we all had to grieve the office that we had been a part of and the LA Más that we thought we were going to do and let go of that. And so we didn't really do much for the first 2 weeks of April, I would say. Mm-hmm. And then we put all of our projects on hold for another 2 weeks while we discussed next steps. So we will do things like that as a team where we kind of, we all get together and triage and talk about how the work is reflecting the mission and where we're going and do those kinds of assessments too, which is helpful.
Yeah. Helpful and incredibly impressive. And I think, yeah, I mean, I won't take question time like reflection.
Well, and also we're out here in LA. So to all of you, it must sound like we're beating like chakras and like burning sage. And I don't know what it sounds like to you, no. But I think we're really committed to the idea that everyone's well-being is important. And that everyone in the organization, this is a moment in time for them. This isn't their lives. And so if we openly talk with staff when they're thinking about transitioning into a new job or a different context, and we work with them to make introductions and to help support them in the next phase of their career. So for us, it's incredibly important because we've had different past professional experiences where those conversations weren't public. Mm-hmm. And we felt that was really harmful and traumatic. So we've been really careful about our culture.
It sounds really humane and it does not sound like burning sage. I think it sounds great. And I think
we do that too, though. We burn some sage, I will tell you what.
That's okay.
And Palo Santo and all of that stuff. I'll get into some incense like nobody's business.
You know, it's all about a comfortable environment, inclusive, comfortable environment. And I think because I know we're sort of coming a little bit up on our time, I think we can combine maybe Ronit and Edward's questions, comments about architectural education, the student experience. Edward asked, how would you recommend getting something similar started as a student? And Ronit asks, I'm curious, in hindsight, what if any shifts would you now imagine for architecture education? So, being the institution we are and kind of having all these hands and eyes and brains on deck, how do you think about architectural education and student agency?
I inherited from my father, who was a licensed architect, so many books on structures and assembly, and I don't know, and I've never even opened those things. I have my scars from building boats, and I can make things, and I know how I'm a three-dimensional thinker, but I would have so much preferred, instead of the entire structures course, which I don't remember any of, I would so much have preferred a conversation around like sociology, right? Or like a kind of, maybe instead we're really going to get into development, and we're going to talk about real estate development. And so you get to architects are going to be faced with we have climate change, we have housing crisis, we have a lot of really different but overlapping crises that we're all going to be all hands on deck trying to help solve so that humanity can continue. And it's insane to me that we teach architecture in the same way, and that it's accredited, and that deans are held to this really strict kind of rubric, and it doesn't offer flexibility for us to really be entrepreneurs, but also address the kind of emerging conditions that are beginning to happen and need different expertise. And I think it's really hard on students to do courses around social activism and not take those courses, right? You're sitting in a structures class, and then you're taking a studio on affordable housing, and you're supposed to talk about local residents, but you're also not taking any of those classes around sociology or anthropology or how to kind of decenter yourself. And so students are asked nowadays to be lead experts, to be sociologists, to be structural engineers, to be climate change experts. Like, students are asked to be so many different things that I think it puts a lot of stress, and it's really unclear where someone should kind of graduate into the field and what their contribution should be. And I don't think we should be asking that much of everyone. So I would say that it's an incredible architecture education, but I do think it needs to be radically changed. And I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but, that being said, that's my perspective. I'm also not a licensed architect, and I might have a very different perspective if I was a licensed architect.
Well, we didn't ask you because we knew what your answer would be, and we wanted a specific answer. We wanted your perspective. So thank you so much for taking an hour and a half of your time to spend with us. It was, I think, an incredible sort of transparent view of a real process you went through, or you and your team went through, from fee for service to place-based, and kind of the real process that it takes to change. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. Normally, there would be just so much applause and cheering.
Thank you.
And balloons and all these things. And we'd be able to have delivery pizza after. But that's this is 2021 for now. So thanks.
We need to get a pizza button as a reaction at the bottom of the screen. We'll talk to Zoom about that.
Yeah.
True.
So
Thank you to the donors again, Craig and Mimi.
thanks to all the students and the faculty and everyone for questions. I think that was really energizing and fulfilling. So see you guys sometime soon in Zoom land.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Anyone can reach out to me at elizabeth@mas.la.
Thank you so much. I will be in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you.
It's wild to watch all the people go away.
Yeah, it's also a little funny to see how many people are stuck that have left their computer on maybe and stepped away.
Yeah, that happens in studio sometimes. Even.
Yeah.
That's so funny. Well, just let me know if there's anything else you need. And I think we'd love to share the recording or
Yeah,
any
definitely.
other things.
Oh, stop it. Stop it.